Hi, I'm Michael Stittle,
And I'm Nick Nanos.
and welcome to a special episode of Trendline, where we're talking about the fallout from the Ontario provincial election this week. An absolute crushing victory for the Progressive Conservatives. And Nick, we've seen two opposition leaders resign in the aftermath of this. So let's go back over this election. I mean, how did the polling match up with what we saw last night?
Well, the CTV News CP24 Nanos polling did quite well. When you look at the trend line, we're basically spot on. We were within the margin of error, and we kind of captured the fact that the Progressive Conservatives were going to a crushing, as you mentioned, victory. The thing is this was an interesting an election because it was quite unusual. When was the last time we saw, for example, the two opposition parties or two of the parties almost in a statistical dead heat at like 23.7% each. It was like the perfect scenario for the Progressive Conservatives to split that progressive vote and capture more seats.
Yeah, I mean, overall, just your trend. I saw the NDP starting to inch upwards, and the Liberals just seemed to kind of not go off a cliff, but they really lost support quickly, and then ended up in this bizarre statistical tie, as you said. And
Yeah.
so what's the difference between that? I mean, how does it really affect how many seats they can win when they're just under 30% and they're at the same as their rival?
Well, what was absolutely clear was that in our seat projections that we were doing, the modeling that we're doing, was that the NDP support was more efficient at converting into seats than the Liberal support. The Liberals won some seats by massive margins, like in the downtown Toronto and stuff like that, but it's like inefficient. So as a result, we have to remember the Liberals now will not have official party status for another 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be for the Liberals a major in Ontario, a major problem. There will be a lost generation of Liberal organizers, candidates, apparatchiks. There'll be a lost generation because there won't be those jobs that come with either being in the government or the opposition. And it'll be 8 years in the wilderness where the Liberal Party of Ontario, once mighty, once ruled for more than a decade, now doesn't even register as a party at Queen's Park. So it's going to take a while for the provincial Liberals to recover from this, and I'm not sure it's going to happen, between now and the next 4 years. I think they have to think of a rebuilding that's going to take much longer.
So Nick, both Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca and Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath, they both resigned. They both announced that they were stepping down last night. So where should these parties go in the future? I mean, what can they learn from this, and what sort of a leader do they need to rebuild?
This was a really bizarre election because, as someone that was watching it like throughout, I was really surprised by the fact that I didn't think that either the Liberals or the New Democrats landed any punches on Doug Ford. And it almost seemed like for the Liberals, I thought that it seemed like their campaign, they were trying to run a safe campaign where they were running to be second as part of a longer term strategy. But you know what? Running for second basically dooms your ability to win and challenge. And I just had that feeling as I watched the Liberal campaign throughout. And, for Andrea Horwath and the New Democrats, this still has to be disappointing, even though they're the opposition. The fact of the matter is, their popular support went down compared to their breakthrough election in 2018. The number of seats that they had went down. And for Andrea Horwath, she didn't have that same type of stellar, exciting performance that she had in 2018. She was flat. So, but this is for the Progressive Conservatives, total victory. We've never seen this. We don't see this very often. Not only did they win the same percentage as they did pretty well back in 2018, their main opponents resigned. So it's not just victory in the number of seats, not just victory in the percentage support. They crushed it. They crushed their opponents, and now their two other main challengers have to have a complete rebuild to be competitive with Doug Ford. And now I think we should just say Ontario is now the Ford nation. Before this, I would hazard to say that Toronto was the Ford nation because of Rob Ford and Doug Ford and the one election win. Now with a second election win, Ontario is now firmly in the column of the Ford Nation, and the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario is his.
Mm.
It's his movement and his new coalition that he's built, which is now basically a new conservative juggernaut in Ontario.
And Doug Ford did this with the lowest voter turnout in Ontario's history. I want to talk about that later in this show, but and we will get into that. But first, if you are a federal political party in this country and you see this overwhelming victory by Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives, I mean, what's your takeaway from this? What are you learning from this?
Well, if you're a federal Liberal, you're looking at the Liberal brand in Ontario just basically got a beating, right? That there was no political brand coattails for the Liberals or kind of residual draw, and that's one of the key takeaways. The other thing is that the Conservatives picked up seats. Think of it this way: we just had a federal election. There are seats that voted Liberal in the last federal election in Ontario, and now are voting Progressive Conservative in the most recent Ontario election. Like the Bramptons, right? The Bramptons, I think they're all Liberal federally, and this week's election, all Conservative.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
So if you're a federal Liberal organizer, you got to be looking at this and thinking, the brand is on its back heels in Ontario. The party doesn't even have party status. People are grumpy, and they opted for a pragmatic alternative. For the New Democrats, they have to be disappointed. For Jagmeet Singh, on a personal basis, his brother lost, right, one of those Brampton seats, and that's not just a setback for the party in Ontario, but that's also a setback for Jagmeet Singh on a personal basis because it's his brother. So, and then, for the Democrats, they came across as tired. So, I think they have to be worried. And now if you're a conservative, the one thing about the federal Conservatives, you got to be looking at this, and it's like the new franchise for victory in Ontario. We'll call it the Ford franchise for now. What is that? It's not being ideological. It's not being kind of over the top. It's being pragmatic, right? Being realistic, being consistent. And I think if you're one of those federal leadership aspirants, you got to be looking at this. And I also noticed that Pierre Poilievre just recently tweeted that he wanted to roll back vaccine mandates and all that other kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That is in complete opposition to what Doug Ford kicked Conservatives out of caucus because they refused to share their vaccination status or get vaccinated. So, hey, Pierre Poilievre, maybe this is a little bit of a wake-up call that if you want to have traction to win in Ontario, look at what Doug Ford is doing.
I mean, you've said this in several past Trendline episodes, Nick, that the middle is kind of opened up in the Canadian political spectrum, that there's a lot of place to grow if you're a progressive conservative government or a federal conservative government. So what do you think this means for Jean Charest and people who are more sort of, I guess, center-right federally?
Well, I think we should put Jean Charest and Patrick Brown together. But I think this speaks to a certain level of pragmatism. Let's face it, Doug Ford accepted subsidized daycare from the Liberals, like the $10 a day. Like who would have thought? Who would have thought of that? And the Ford government has, during the pandemic, engaged in stimulus spending. Even though they are conservative minded and fiscally very conservative, and this speaks to him basically not abandoning conservative principles, but just being pragmatic. You know what? Most voters are not ideological. They want pragmatic decisions and decision makings from their elected officials. That's what I think Ontarians believe that they're getting with Doug Ford, and the pandemic was a case in point. When he made a mistake, he said, "I made a mistake, and we're gonna fix that." And at the same time, he was consistent. I think, and Jason Kenney could have taken a lesson from Doug Ford because Jason Kenney was too ideological, and as a result, he's a political casualty right now.
Nick, the other big story in this Ontario election is the historic low voter turnout, the lowest voter turnout in Ontario's history. I think it's something like 43%.
43.
So Doug Ford has won this crushing victory, but I think for all the eligible voters who could have cast a ballot, I think he only actually got less than, I don't know, 18% of the votes, unless my math is really bad on this.
Yeah.
But that's incredible.
Well, it's incredible. First of all, that's the way our system works. So it doesn't diminish from his victory, because you know what? Those are the rules. He won. And usually when there's a low voter turnout, that favors incumbents, and that was definitely the case. But I think what happened in this particular election is that for the Liberals and the New Democrats, they ran uninspiring campaigns, and people were just not motivated to come out and vote. And they couldn't probably bring themselves, for a certain proportion of Ontarians, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Progressive Conservatives, so they stayed home. I'd like to say one other thing that's really interesting about this election. It has to do with the ballot numbers by gender. Doug Ford had a 26-point advantage in the ballot numbers among men, and among women, it was a three-way tie between the Progressive Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP. There is a massive gender divide in this province. So last night, if you were a male voter, you're fist pumping, right? Because you wanted Ford to win. You wanted him to win big. If you were a female voter, you're probably going, I can't believe that Doug Ford has won a majority government, because, just as many women would vote for, the Liberals, the New Democrats, or the Progressive Conservatives.
Nick, it seemed like for the Liberals and the NDP, a lot of what they were campaigning on was just this message of them not being Doug Ford, not being the Progressive Conservatives, and they clearly seem to have a tough time engaging with voters on the issues that that matter to them. And you've done polling on this. I mean, what are those issues? What were voters looking for?
Well, it's interesting. In the last poll that we did for CTV News and CP24, we asked Ontarians what they wanted the future priorities of the new government, whoever that might be, to be. And what's interesting is that at the top of the list, and we saw this throughout the tracking, at the top of the list was focusing on healthcare, and then after that was focusing on the rising cost of living. The interesting thing in all of this is that you have to think, I think one of the reasons why the provincial Liberals did so poorly is because, in our polling, it was very clear that Ford had the advantage on meat and potatoes issues, the cost of living, housing, inflation, gas, all that kind of stuff. He had a clear advantage as being trusted on those issues. The NDP actually had the advantage on healthcare and trust on healthcare. Del Duca had advantage on nothing. Zip, nada, right? So there was no defining strength, policy strength, for him to engage voters. But you know what? Even with this crushing victory that Doug Ford has had over his opponents, his next 4 years are not going to be easy, like many of the other premiers. Because the reality is we're still recovering from the pandemic. Inflation and interest rates are on the rise. Housing prices are up. We could have a recession potentially in the coming year, and it's going to be a difficult time. So I think for Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives, they should accept their victory, do their victory lap, but I think they have to start to be prepared to deal with some of these big issues, these meat and potatoes issues, and healthcare that Ontarians want to hear about.
So winning might have been the easiest part of this. The hard work is ahead for him. So
yeah, and you know what? The guy's going to get a free ride at Queen's Park, because there's going to be some vacant seats over there on the other side with no clear leader, with opposition parties that probably will not be as sharp in their attacks as they would be if they had a permanent leader. So it's like shadow puppets, man. It's just going to be like shadow puppets in Queen's Park, where Ford's going to go up. It's just going to he's going to get a free ride. He's probably going to get a free ride at Queen's Park in the Parliament, at least until the Liberals and NDP pick successors to Del Duca and Horvath.
Nick, it's just an absolute fascinating outcome, and always thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.